Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place? The salesman said it with a smile, but his eyes lingered on her dark skin, her gray hoodie, and her worn running shoes. In that instant, before she even opened her mouth, he had already decided she did not belong. Yet she walked past him anyway, straight toward the Mercedes GLE 450, obsidian black, priced at $89,500, exactly what she had come for. That's when he made the call. Minutes later, a police officer walked through the glass doors of Whitaker Luxury Motors on Westfield Boulevard in Atlanta. He looked across the showroom floor at the white customers browsing and the salesman in suits, then fixed his gaze on the one black woman standing next to a luxury vehicle. He asked no questions. He walked straight to her, grabbed her wrist, and snapped the handcuffs shut right there in the middle of the showroom under the bright halogen lights, in front of everyone. A cashier's check for $89,500 sat in her pocket, made out to the dealership. She had come to buy the car. Nobody intervened. Nobody spoke, until the front door opened once more. The man who walked in, quiet and unhurried in a plain polo shirt and khaki pants, was about to end 2 careers before the morning was over. Drop your city in the comments right now, and stay, because the woman in those handcuffs never once begged. And that is exactly why this story matters. The alarm on Amara Reeves's phone went off that morning, and for the first time in 9 months, she didn't have to be anywhere. No briefing, no rounds, no trauma bay waiting with its fluorescent lights and the particular kind of controlled chaos that had defined every waking hour of her life since she had touched down at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany the previous November. No young soldier on the table in front of her, bleeding in ways that required her hands to remain steady, even when everything inside her was screaming. Just a peaceful morning in Atlanta. Sunlight filtered through the curtains of her mother's spare bedroom. The comforting smell of coffee drifted up the stairs. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, allowing herself to truly feel the quiet. It was a strange sensation, the absence of urgency. After 9 months of existing in a state of permanent readiness, her body didn't quite know what to do with peace. Her mind kept reaching for the next task, the next crisis, the next decision that couldn't wait. She had to consciously remind herself each morning of this leave that the work was done, that she had earned this, that she was allowed to simply breathe. Amara Reeves was 38 years old, a colonel in the United States Army, chief of trauma surgery at one of the most demanding military medical centers in the world, a facility that received the most critically wounded American service members from conflicts across Europe and the Middle East. In the past 9 months alone, she had performed or supervised 214 surgical procedures. 41 of those patients had arrived with injuries her civilian colleagues would have classified as unsalvageable. She had saved 37 of them. She had grown up in Atlanta, the daughter of a retired school teacher and a man who drove delivery trucks 6 days a week and never once complained about it. She had been the first in her family to attend college, the first to attend West Point, the first itaste to pin on her silver eagle. Her mother, Vivian Reeves, had framed every promotion photo and hung them in a neat row down the hallway of the house on Peachtree Circle, a gallery that told the story of a woman who had spent 2 decades proving that the space she occupied was hers by right, not by permission. But that morning, Amara wasn't a colonel. She wasn't a surgeon. She was a daughter, and she had a plan. Her mother's 70th birthday was coming up soon. Vivian Reeves had spent decades driving a 12-year-old Honda with a driver's side window that stuck in cold weather and a check engine light that had been glowing steadily since the second Obama administration. She had never once complained about it. She had never asked for anything beyond what her daughter could reasonably provide, which was exactly why Amara had spent the last 3 years setting aside every deployment allowance, every overseas pay supplement, every bonus that came through her account into a savings fund she had quietly labeled in her banking app as Mom's Car. The total as of recently was $94,200. The car she had selected after 3 weeks of research, conducted on a military laptop between shifts, was a Mercedes-Benz GLE 4500, obsidian black exterior, macchiato beige interior, the AMG line package, which added the sport suspension and the 20-inch alloy wheels her mother would never know the name of, but would feel every time she pulled out of the driveway. The MSRP was $89,500. The remaining amount would cover tax, title, and registration, with enough left for a full tank of gas and a bow large enough to be embarrassing. Whitaker Luxury Motors on Westfield Boulevard was the only dealership in Atlanta that had the exact configuration in stock. She dressed simply: gray hoodie, dark jeans, white running shoes. She wasn't going to a military function. She wasn't reporting for duty. She was running an errand on her day off the way any 38-year-old woman might, and she dressed accordingly. She tucked the sealed envelope into the front pocket of her hoodie. It contained a personal check made out to Whitaker Luxury Motors for $89,500 and a printed copy of the vehicle configuration she had confirmed by phone the previous afternoon. She kissed her mother on the cheek, told her she'd be back by noon, and pulled out of the driveway in her 2018 Honda Accord. The drive was straightforward. She pulled into the lot at Whitaker Luxury Motors that morning. The dealership was impressive even from the outside. A 3-story glass and steel structure that caught the morning light and threw it back in all directions. 47 vehicles on the floor, according to their website. A staff of 31. Annual revenue that the Atlanta Business Chronicle had most recently reported at just over $42 million. She parked, checked the envelope one more time, and walked through the front doors. The showroom smelled like new leather and wealth. Soft music played from invisible speakers. The floors were polished concrete, and the vehicles sat on raised platforms like sculptures in a gallery. 3 salesmen stood near the reception desk. One was on the phone. One was typing at a computer and was doing nothing at all. None of them moved toward her. She stood just inside the entrance for a full 30 seconds, long enough for all 3 to register her presence, long enough for the one doing nothing to make direct eye contact with her, hold it for a moment, and then deliberately look back down at his phone. She had been in combat zones where the hostility was more honest than this. She walked toward the GLE 450 at the back of the floor. Obsidian black, exactly as specified. And somewhere behind her, a salesman named Brent Caldwell finally put his phone down and started walking in her direction. Brent Caldwell had worked at Whitaker Luxury Motors for 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days. In that time, he had developed what he privately thought of as an instinct. He couldn't have explained it in writing. He certainly couldn't have defended it in front of a human resources panel. But in the practiced, self-congratulatory logic of his own mind, it was simply a professional skill. The ability to read a customer and assess within the first 30 seconds of an interaction whether the person standing in front of him represented a genuine sale or a waste of time. He was 29 years old. He drove a leased Audi A4. He wore slim-cut suits from a mid-range department store and had perfected a handshake that communicated confidence without trying too hard. He had been the dealership's 3rd highest salesman for the past 2 years, a fact he referenced in conversation more often than anyone around him found comfortable. His instinct, as he had refined it over 4 years, operated on a very specific and very simple calculus, one he would never have admitted to out loud. Not in those terms, not in this decade, but one that shaped every interaction he had on that showroom floor. It was the calculus of who looked like money, and more specifically, who looked like the kind of money that belonged here. When Amara Reeves walked through the front doors of Whitaker Luxury Motors that morning, Brent's instinct made its assessment in approximately 4 seconds. Dark skin, gray hoodie, worn running shoes, a Honda Accord visible through the glass doors behind her parked 3 spaces down, no jewelry beyond small stud earrings, no designer bag, no visible markers of the kind of wealth this showroom was built to receive. He put his phone in his jacket pocket and crossed the floor toward her, not with urgency, but with the specific brand of unhurried condescension that he had mistaken for 4 years for professionalism. "Morning," he said, stopping a few feet short of where she stood near the GLE 450. He did not extend his hand. "Can I help you find something?" "I'm looking at this one," Amara said. She didn't look at him. She was reading the spec sheet mounted on the driver's side window. Brent glanced at the vehicle. The GLE 450 AMG line, the second most expensive unit on the floor. He looked back at her. "That's a beautiful car," he said, and his tone managed in 5 words to communicate that he did not believe she was there to buy it. "Are you looking for yourself, or is this more of a browsing situation?" Amara turned and looked at him for the first time. "I'm buying it," she said simply. Brent smiled. The polished professional smile. "Of course. Well, we do have some financing options that can make our inventory more accessible. I could walk you through some numbers, see what kind of monthly payment works for your situation." "I'm not financing," Amara said. "I'm paying cash." A small pause. Brent recalibrated. Not enough to change his posture, not enough to change his tone, but enough to shift the angle slightly. "Cash is great. Do you have documentation of funds? It's standard procedure for vehicles at this price point. We do ask for verification before a test drive." It was not standard procedure. Lila Park, watching from behind the reception desk with a ceramic mug of coffee going cold in her hands, knew it was not standard procedure. She had worked at this dealership for 6 years. She had never once seen Brent ask a white customer for documentation of funds before a test drive. Not once. But she didn't say anything. She looked down at her desk. Amara reached into the pocket of her hoodie and produced the sealed envelope. She opened it, withdrew the personal check, and held it out. Brent took it. He looked at the amount. His expression shifted, a micro-movement around the jaw, a fractional tightening, and then he handed it back. "This is a personal check," he said. "For a transaction of this size, we typically prefer certified funds, a cashier's check, or wire transfer. I can have a cashier's check here within the hour." "The funds are available," Amara said. "I confirmed the vehicle by phone yesterday afternoon." "Right," Brent said. "With who?" "A woman named Sandra in your sales department." Brent nodded slowly in the way of someone who is not actually absorbing the information been given to them. "I'll need to verify that. And we'd also need a credit check on file before we can proceed regardless of payment method. Again, standard for vehicles at this tier." Amara looked at him. A long, steady look. She had spent 14 years reading rooms, reading people, identifying the source of a threat before it fully materialized. And what she saw in Brent Caldwell's face was not policy. It was not procedure. It was the particular discomfort of a man confronting a reality that didn't match the story he had already written. "I'd like to speak with your manager," she said. Brent's smile didn't waver. "Of course. Let me just give me one moment." He walked toward the back corridor, unhurried, unbothered, the soles of his dress shoes tapping evenly against the polished concrete. Lila Park watched him go. She set down her coffee. Something was wrong. She had felt it gathering since the moment he crossed the floor, and she didn't know yet what to do about it. In the staff corridor behind the showroom floor, Brent was not looking for the manager. He was pulling out his phone, scrolling to a number, pressing call. The line picked up on the second ring. "Yeah," he said quietly, his back to the door. "I need you to send someone over to the showroom. We've got a situation." He didn't say suspicious activity. Not yet. But the word was already forming behind his teeth, and once it left his mouth, nothing in that showroom would ever be the same. The staff corridor behind the showroom floor was narrow and fluorescent lit, lined on one side with filing cabinets, and on the other with a row of coat hooks where the salesmen hung their jackets during lunch. It smelled like printer toner and stale coffee. Brent Caldwell stood at the far end of it, his back to the door, his voice low and deliberate. The person on the other end of the line was the dispatch operator for the Atlanta Police Department's Zone 5 precinct. Brent had called them twice before in 4 years. Once when a teenager had been leaning against a vehicle for what Brent decided was too long, and once when 2 men he didn't recognize had spent 20 minutes looking at a truck on the outdoor lot. Both times an officer had arrived. Both times the individuals had left. Both times Brent had written the outcome into his private mental ledger under the heading, "Instinct Confirmed." He chose his words carefully now. Not because he doubted himself, because he had learned from experience that certain words opened certain doors faster than others. "We've got a suspicious individual on the showroom floor," he said. "Female. She's been handling one of our higher-end vehicles, and she doesn't appear to be a legitimate customer. I'm concerned she may be casing the inventory." The dispatcher asked him to describe the individual. Black female, mid-30s maybe. Gray hoodie, jeans, sneakers. Arrived in an older model Honda. The dispatcher confirmed a unit would be dispatched. Brent thanked her. He put his phone in his pocket, straightened his jacket, and pushed back through the door into the showroom. Amara was still standing beside the GLE 450. She had opened the driver's side door. It was unlocked, as all display vehicles were, and was examining the interior. She ran one hand along the leather of the steering wheel. She was not frantic. She was not hurried. She had the careful, methodical attention of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and was confirming it against a mental checklist. Brent crossed the floor and stopped a few feet away. "Ma'am, I'd ask that you not handle the vehicle without a sales associate present." Amara looked at him. "You are the sales associate," she said, "and I asked to speak with a manager. She's in a call right now. It shouldn't be long." He glanced toward the front doors. "Why don't we move over to the consultation area? I can get you some water while you wait." Amara closed the car door. She did not move toward the consultation area. She leaned against the side of the vehicle, arms folded, and waited. Lila Park had come out from behind the reception desk. She was straightening a rack of brochures near the front of the showroom, which put her approximately 15 feet from Amara and gave her a direct sight line to the front doors. She wasn't straightening brochures. She was watching. Her stomach had been tight since the moment Brent walked into that corridor with his phone already out. And in 6 years of working at this dealership, she had learned to trust that particular tightening. She saw the patrol car before anyone else did. It pulled up to the curb on Westfield Boulevard. A standard white and blue Atlanta Police Department cruiser moving without lights or sirens. It parked directly in front of the dealership entrance. The driver's side door opened. Officer Bryce Dalton stepped out. He was 34 years old and had been with the Atlanta PD for 6 years. He was broad-shouldered and moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never had reason to question whether a room would accommodate him. He adjusted his duty belt as he approached the entrance, a small, habitual gesture, practiced and automatic, and pushed through the glass doors. The showroom received him the way showrooms receive police officers, a slight recalibration. White customers glanced up, registered the uniform, and returned to what they were doing. The salesman at the reception desk straightened almost imperceptibly. Lila Park stopped pretending to sort brochures. Dalton didn't sweep the room the way a cautious officer might. He didn't take a moment to assess. He had been given a description over dispatch, and his eyes went directly and immediately to the black woman standing beside the Mercedes in the back of the showroom. He walked toward her. He did not stop at the reception desk. He did not speak to Brent, who was now standing near the consultation area with his hands clasped in front of him. He did not ask a single question of anyone before he closed the distance between himself and Amara Reeves. "Ma'am?" His voice was flat, official. "Step away from the vehicle. I need to speak with you." Amara turned to face him. She took one step away from the car, not because she was startled, but because she was careful, always about eliminating variables. She kept her hands visible at her sides. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked. "We received a call about a suspicious individual on the premises. I need you to come with me and answer a few questions." "What am I suspected of?" Dalton's jaw tightened slightly. He was not accustomed to the question being returned so quickly and so calmly. "We received a report of—" "I'm a customer," Amara said. Her voice was even, unhurried, and carried just far enough to reach the nearest cluster of white shoppers who had stopped moving. "I have been attempting to purchase a vehicle. If there is a specific crime I am suspected of committing, I would like to know what it is." Dalton looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Brent. Brent gave the smallest possible nod, barely a tilt of the chin, barely anything. It was enough. "Ma'am," Dalton said, "I'm going to need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back." The showroom went completely still. Nobody moved. Not the white couple examining the Range Rover 2 platforms over who had turned at the sound of Dalton's voice and now stood frozen with a brochure between them. Not the elderly man near the front who had been asking a salesman about financing options and had simply stopped mid-sentence. Not the young woman with the stroller who had wandered in off the street to use the restroom and now stood at the edge of the showroom floor with her hand on the handle watching. Lila Park stood by the brochure rack with both hands flat against her thighs. She could feel her own pulse in her fingertips. Amara Reeves did not turn around. She stood facing Officer Bryce Dalton with her hands still visible at her sides and her shoulders straight. Not with defiance, not with aggression, but with the particular stillness of a woman who had spent 14 years operating in environments where losing control of your body language could cost someone their life. In the trauma bay, in the field, in every room that had ever tried to make her smaller than she was, she had learned that composure was not the absence of feeling. It was the mastery of it. "Officer," she said, "I have not committed a crime. I came to this dealership to purchase a vehicle. I have a cashier's check in my pocket made out to Whitaker Luxury Motors for the full purchase price. I would ask you to please verify that before taking any further action." "Ma'am, this is not a request. Turn around. I'm asking you to verify. Turn around. Now." There was a man near the back of the showroom, mid-40s, wearing a Georgia Tech sweatshirt, waiting for his wife who was in the restroom. He had already pulled out his phone. He held it at waist height, screen facing up, recording. He didn't announce it. He didn't make a scene. He just pressed the button and kept very still and let the camera see what his eyes were seeing. Amara looked at Dalton for one long, measured second. She was performing a calculation, not of escape, not of resistance, but of damage. She was a trauma surgeon. She understood triage. She understood that some battles were not won in the moment they were fought, and that surviving the moment intact was sometimes the only victory available. She turned around, slowly, hands coming up. The handcuffs came from Dalton's belt with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many times. The metal was cold. The first cuff closed around her left wrist with a sound, a clean mechanical click, that seemed to travel across the showroom floor and reach every person in the building at exactly the same moment. The second cuff followed. Amara Reeves stood in the middle of Whitaker Luxury Motors on Westfield Boulevard in Atlanta, in handcuffs. She did not cry. She did not struggle. She did not make a sound. She looked straight ahead at the far wall of the showroom, where a large illuminated sign read, "Whitaker Luxury Motors, where excellence meets you." She read it once. She read it again. She focused on the letters the way she had once focused on the second hand of a clock in a recovery room in Kandahar when her hands were shaking after a 10-hour surgery and she needed them to stop. The envelope in her front hoodie pocket pressed against her chest. Inside it, the check. $89,500. The funds she had built dollar by dollar over 3 years, deployment allowance by deployment allowance, every overseas supplement, and every bonus that had passed through her account while she was saving lives in a building 45 minutes outside of Stuttgart. She had written her mother's name in the memo line, for Vivian. Happy birthday. Brent Caldwell stood near the consultation table with his arms crossed and his chin slightly elevated. He had the expression of a man who believed he had handled the situation correctly. Lila Park looked at Brent. Then she looked at Amara. Then she looked at the floor. She pressed her lips together and said nothing. She had said nothing the first time. She had said nothing the second time. She had built a very efficient internal architecture of silence over 6 years, brick by brick, and she was standing inside it now, and it had never felt as small or as suffocating as it did at this moment. The man in the Georgia Tech sweatshirt kept recording. 2 other customers had their phones out now. A young black woman near the entrance had both hands wrapped around hers, knuckles tight, jaw set, recording without blinking. An older white man in a blazer stood with his device raised openly, not hiding it, making no effort to be discreet. Dalton noticed the phones. Something shifted behind his eyes, not remorse, not doubt, but the specific awareness of a man who has just understood that there are witnesses. He straightened slightly. He placed one hand on Amara's arm above the elbow and said with the performative calm of someone who is now aware of an audience, "I'm going to need you to come with me outside, ma'am." "I'm not going anywhere," Amara said. Her voice was quiet, level. It did not shake. "I am standing in this building because I have the legal right to be here. I have committed no crime, and I am not leaving without documentation of why I am being detained." Dalton tightened his grip on her arm. And then, in the particular silence that had settled over the showroom like a held breath, the front door opened. The bell above it chimed softly. A man in a white polo shirt and khaki pants stepped inside. He was 64 years old. He was not tall in the way that draws attention. He was not loud. He carried no visible authority, wore no visible rank, projected none of the theatrical dominance that Dalton carried in his uniform, and his duty belt, and his practiced hands. He simply stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the room. And then his eyes found Amara. Harlan Whitaker had not planned to come in that morning. He had planned to spend the morning at his kitchen table with a second cup of coffee and the sports section of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which he still received in print because he was 64 years old and had earned the right to read news on paper if he wanted to. He had planned to drive out to his daughter's house in Decatur by noon for lunch, then spend the afternoon doing nothing in particular. a skill he had been attempting to develop since his retirement from the United States Army 3 years ago with limited success. He had stopped by the dealership on impulse. He did that sometimes on weekends, not to check on the staff, not to review numbers, but simply because the building was his, and he felt at home in it in the uncomplicated way that people feel at home in places they built with intention. He had purchased the original lot on Westfield Boulevard 18 years ago, with the proceeds from his first real estate investment and a loan he had paid back in 4 years. He had overseen the construction of the current 3-story structure himself, had chosen the concrete for the floors and the grade of the glass for the facade and the temperature of the lighting, because he believed that the environment a business created told people before a single word was spoken exactly how much it valued them. He had built this place to tell people they were valued. He parked his personal vehicle, a 7-year-old Chevrolet Suburban that his assistant had repeatedly suggested he replace, in the rear lot, which was why no one at the front desk had seen him coming. He came through the staff entrance, nodded to a technician he recognized from the service department, and walked through the interior corridor toward the showroom floor. He heard the stillness before he saw the cause of it. There was a particular quality to silence in a busy public space, the way it announced itself by contrast. The way a room full of people, who have all stopped talking at once, communicated without a single word that something had happened that none of them knew how to respond to. Harlan Whitaker had spent 31 years in the United States Army and had learned to read that quality of silence the way other men read weather. He pushed through the interior door and stepped onto the showroom floor. He saw the police officer first, broad-shouldered, hand on a woman's arm, positioned between her and the exit. Then he saw the customers, frozen. Phones raised, a collection of people who had come in to look at cars and were now witnesses to something that had nothing to do with cars. He saw Brent Caldwell standing near the consultation table with his arms crossed and his chin up. Then he saw Amara. The recognition arrived in his chest before it reached his mind, the specific gut-level recognition of a face he had known for 20 years. He saw the handcuffs. He saw the envelope-shaped outline pressing against the front pocket of her hoodie. He saw the way she was standing, spine straight, eyes forward. That particular composure he had watched her develop from a 19-year-old plebe at West Point into one of the finest officers he had ever had the privilege of knowing. And he understood immediately and completely what had happened in his building. He did not hurry. Hurrying communicated alarm, and alarm communicated that the situation required alarm, and this situation required something different. It required the specific gravity-laden calm of a man who has never once needed to prove that the ground beneath his feet belonged to him. He walked across the showroom floor, past the couple with the brochure, past the elderly man who had stopped mid-sentence, past the young woman with the stroller. His footsteps were quiet on the polished concrete, and the room tracked him, heads turning, people stepping back slightly, creating a path without being asked. He stopped 6 feet from Officer Dalton, the receptionist at the front desk, a young man named Marcus, who had started 3 months ago and was still learning the hierarchy of the building, had risen halfway out of his chair without realizing it. He recognized the man who had just crossed the floor. He had seen him in photographs on the wall of the general manager's office and in the framed article from the Atlanta Business Chronicle above the water cooler. He sat back down and said nothing. Dalton heard the shift in the room before he consciously registered it. He turned. He saw a man in a white polo shirt and khaki pants, 60-something, silver hair short and neat, unremarkable build, nothing that the practiced eye of a 6-year veteran would flag as a threat or an authority. He released Amara's arm, not because he felt commanded to, but because the movement was reflexive. a small automatic concession to the fact that someone was now standing close enough to be a participant. "Sir, ma'am," Dalton said, "I'm going to need you to step back. This is an active situation," Harlan said. The word was quiet, almost gentle. It stopped Dalton mid-sentence, not because of its volume, but because of its texture, because it carried within it the absolute absence of uncertainty. And uncertainty was the one thing Dalton had been relying on to control this situation from the moment he walked through the door. "I need you to tell me exactly what you believe this woman has done." Dalton straightened. "We received a call about a suspicious individual. This woman matches the description provided by a staff member. She refused to—" "What is her name?" Harlan asked. Dalton paused. The caller described—" "Agat Samatsamakuan." "Do you know her name?" "No, sir. Her name," Harlan said, "is Colonel Amara Reeves, United States Army." He let that sit in the air for exactly 1 second. "And I think you should hear the rest of what I have to say before you decide what happens next." The showroom had gone the kind of quiet that has weight to it, not the polite quiet of a business conducting itself in a measured, professional manner, not the anticipatory quiet of people waiting for a transaction to conclude. This was the held-breath quiet of 23 people who understood at some instinctive and collective level that what was happening in front of them was not ordinary, that the man in the white polo shirt had just said something in a tone that carried no heat whatsoever, yet had nonetheless fundamentally altered the temperature of the room. Officer Bryce Dalton looked at Harlan Whitaker. He performed in the space of approximately 3 seconds the same kind of rapid assessment he had been trained to perform at the scene of an incident. Age, early 60s. Build, unremarkable. Clothing, casual. No visible identifiers. Demeanor, calm to the point of being unusual. None of it matched the internal profile that Dalton had built over 6 years for the category of person whose instructions he felt compelled to follow. That category was populated by people in uniforms, people behind desks with titles on placards, people whose authority was visible and legible and immediately verifiable. This man wore a polo shirt and khakis and spoke with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never once needed a visible credential. Dalton's jaw set. "Sir, I appreciate you sharing that, but unless you have documentation verifying this individual's identity and your relationship to her, I need you to step back and allow me to complete." "I own this building," Harlan said. The sentence was short. It was not delivered with emphasis. It was delivered the way one might state a fact about the weather, because it was simply true, and the truth of it required no performance. Dalton blinked. "Sir, every vehicle on this floor, every square foot of this structure, the lot outside, the signage, the service bays in the back." Harlan looked around the showroom once, briefly, the way a man looks at something he has looked at 10,000 times and still finds familiar. "I built this dealership 18 years ago. My name is on the deed, the business license, and the sign above the door you walked through this morning." He returned his gaze to Dalton. "And the woman you have placed in handcuffs is a decorated colonel in the United States Army who came here today to purchase a vehicle with a cashier's check that is currently sitting in her pocket." Brent Caldwell, standing near the consultation table, had uncrossed his arms sometime in the last 30 seconds without noticing. His hands were now at his sides, and he was very still. Dalton looked at Amara, then back at Harlan. The architecture of his confidence was not collapsing. It was something more specific than that. It was reconfiguring. He was a man who had operated for 6 years inside a structure that rewarded certainty, and certainty required that the variables in front of him resolve into a recognizable pattern. What was in front of him now refused to resolve. A black woman in handcuffs who had not once raised her voice, a white-haired man in casual clothing who spoke like every room he had ever entered had been waiting for him. A showroom full of people with phones raised. He made the choice that men who cannot tolerate uncertainty almost always make. He escalated. "Sir, I understand your position, but I am responding to a lawful call regarding suspicious behavior reported by a staff member of this establishment. Regardless of the identity of the individual in question, I am required to complete my investigation before I can." "You were told," Harlan said. And for the first time, there was something beneath the calm. Not anger, but the thing that precedes anger in men who have spent decades learning to keep it below the surface. By an employee acting on bias that a black woman in a gray hoodie was suspicious. You came in, you looked at her, and you put her in handcuffs. That is the complete chain of events. There is no investigation. There is no evidence. There is a black woman standing in my dealership in restraints because she had the misfortune of trying to buy a car on her day off. The room did not move. Dalton's hand had drifted without his full conscious awareness toward his duty belt, not toward his weapon, toward the radio on his left shoulder, the gesture of a man reaching for reinforcement. "General?" He stopped himself. He hadn't meant to use the word. It had arrived unbidden, slipped out of the part of his brain that had been processing the room, and had silently, reluctantly begun to fill in the blanks. Harlan noticed. He let it pass. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Harlan said. "Remove the restraints from Colonel Reeves." "I can't do that until I've completed." "You can," Harlan said, "and you will. Because in a short while, I am going to make a phone call, and the person on the other end of that call is going to tell you the same thing I am telling you right now. Except that by then, the window for this to end quietly will have closed." Dalton looked at him, looked at Amara, looked at the phones raised around the room, looked at Brent, who had taken one small, almost imperceptible step backward toward the staff corridor. He made his decision. "I am not removing those restraints," he said. "I am following established protocol, and I will not be pressured to deviate from procedure by a civilian, regardless of—" Harlan reached into the pocket of his khakis and produced his phone. He dialed. The phone rang twice. The sound was thin and small in the vast quiet of the showroom. 2 electronic pulses that seemed to reach every corner of the room and be heard by every person standing in it. The man in the Georgia Tech sweatshirt kept his phone at waist height, still recording. The young black woman near the entrance had not lowered hers. Neither had the older man in the blazer. 3 separate cameras, 3 separate angles, all of them capturing the same thing. Harlan Whitaker standing in the middle of his own dealership, dialing a number from memory, while a United States Army colonel stood 6 feet away in handcuffs. The line picked up on the second ring. "Harlan." The voice on the other end was female, professional, and carried the particular flatness of someone who had been doing their job long enough to have stopped being surprised by anything. "It is a morning," Harlan said. "Carla, I need you to pull up Officer Bryce Dalton, Zone 5. Tell me what's in his file." A pause. The sound of a chair adjusting, fingers moving to a keyboard. "Give me 30 seconds. Harlan waited. He did not look at Dalton while he waited. He looked at Amara. A brief, direct look that communicated something wordless and precise. She gave the smallest possible nod in return. She was all right. She was still here. She was still standing. "Okay," the voice said. "Dalton, Bryce Michael. 6 years on the force. 3 use-of-force complaints. All 3 marked resolved internally. Signed off by Captain Wayne Ellers." 3, Harlan repeated. He said it clearly at normal conversational volume, which meant everyone within 15 feet heard it. "All resolved internally. That's what it says. Carla, I need Dalton relieved of duty pending a full external review. I need Ehlers on the record by Monday morning explaining how 3 use-of-force complaints against the same officer were resolved without disciplinary action. And I need a formal incident report on what happened here at Whitaker Motors this morning. Time-stamped, full detail, filed before end of business today. There was a brief silence on the other end. Not hesitation, processing. Understood, General. I'll have a supervisor unit there within 15 minutes. Thank you. He ended the call. He looked at Dalton. For the first time since Harlan Whitaker had crossed the showroom floor, Bryce Dalton looked uncertain. Not frightened, not yet. But the quality of his certainty had changed. It had developed a fissure. Small, hairline, but visible to anyone paying attention, and everyone in that room was paying attention. That was Sergeant Carla Nolan, Harlan said. She is your zone supervisor. She is sending a unit here to relieve you of duty, pending a review of this incident and your prior use-of-force history. He paused. I'm making one more call. This one will take a little longer to explain. He dialed again. This time, the phone rang 4 times before a man's voice answered. Unhurried. Dry, with the faint edge of someone who has been interrupted but is too composed to say so. Harlan, it's morning. I know what time it is, Julian. Harlan's tone shifted slightly. Still calm, but warmer. The register of a man speaking to someone he had known for a long time. I need you to start drafting a civil rights complaint. Section 1983. Plaintiff is Colonel Amara Reeves, United States Army. The incident occurred this morning at my Westfield location. I'll send you the details within the hour, but the outline is straightforward. Unlawful detention, excessive force, racial discrimination in a place of public accommodation. How many witnesses? Harlan looked around the room. He counted the raised phones. At least 3 recordings that I can see from where I'm standing. Probably more. I'll have a draft ready by Monday, the voice said. Tell Colonel Reeves I'm sorry this happened. Tell her yourself, Harlan said. I'll have her call you. He ended the call and put the phone back in his pocket. He turned to Dalton. The fissure had widened. It was visible now, not just in his expression, but in his posture. A slight forward bend in the shoulders. A minute contraction around the jaw that communicated in the language of the human body that the ground had shifted, and the person standing on it had not yet decided how to respond to that. Officer Dalton, Harlan said, I want to be clear about something before the supervisor unit arrives. He reached into the breast pocket of his polo shirt and produced a card. Small, white, with the seal of the state of Georgia embossed in the upper left corner. He held it out. Dalton took it, looked at it, and went very still. The card identified Harlan Whitaker as a member of the Georgia Law Enforcement Oversight Commission, the independent body empowered to review, investigate, and make binding recommendations on matters of police conduct across the state of Georgia. The 3 complaints in your file, Harlan said, are now the subject of a formal review. That review will be conducted by my commission, not by your precinct. Captain Ehlers's decisions will be part of that review. And this incident, he gestured briefly and precisely at Amara, at the handcuffs, at the room, will be at the center of it. Dalton's hand moved. It went to Amara's wrist, not with force, but with the mechanical motion of a man performing a task his body had already decided on before his mind had fully caught up. The first cuff opened, then the second. Amara lowered her arms slowly. She brought her hands in front of her and pressed the right thumb into the left palm, a motion so small and so practiced that only someone watching very carefully would have noticed it. Lila Park, watching from across the room, noticed it. She pressed her own hands flat against her thighs and looked at the floor and felt something shift in her chest that she did not yet have a name for. Brent Caldwell had taken 2 steps toward the staff corridor. Harlan looked at him. "Don't," he said quietly. Brent stopped. There is a moment in certain kinds of confrontations, not the loud ones, not the ones conducted in raised voices and slammed doors, but the quiet ones, the ones where the power in the room shifts without anyone shouting, where the people who have been watching from the edges begin to understand that the outcome has already been decided, that the machinery has been set in motion, that what they are witnessing now is not the conflict itself, but the beginning of its resolution. And their only remaining choice is which side of it they want to be standing on when the dust clears. That moment arrived in the showroom of Whitaker Luxury Motors as events unfolded that morning. Lila Park felt it first. She had been standing near the brochure rack for the better part of 30 minutes, and in those 30 minutes she had performed a very precise and very exhausting internal negotiation between 2 versions of herself. The version that had watched Brent Caldwell make his call and said nothing. The version that had watched the handcuffs close and said nothing. The version that had built brick by careful brick a wall of professional silence because she had a mortgage and a daughter in her 2nd year of college and a job she could not afford to lose. And the version that was still in there somewhere, the version that had taken this job because she believed in the business, believed in what the name above the door was supposed to mean, believed that the man who had founded this company had built it to be something better than what she had watched it become in the past 4 years under Brent Caldwell's particular brand of salesmanship. She walked to the reception desk. She sat down. She opened a drawer and took out a legal pad and a pen, and she began to write. She wrote the date and the time at the top of the page. She wrote Brent's name. She wrote the time of the phone call she had watched him make. She wrote the words he had used in the corridor. She had heard them through the door, and she had stored them in the part of her memory that saves things you know you will need later. She wrote the names and rough descriptions of every customer she could identify who had been present. She wrote the time Dalton arrived. She wrote the time the handcuffs were applied. Then she turned to a second page and began writing about the first time. The first time had been 2 years ago. A man named Dr. Calvin Foster. She had looked him up afterward, a cardiologist at Emory University Hospital who had come in wearing scrubs because he had driven directly from a night shift. He had been interested in a Porsche Cayenne. Brent had steered him toward the used inventory. When Dr. Foster had asked to see the Cayenne anyway, Brent had asked for proof of funds. Dr. Foster had left. He had not come back. He had not filed a complaint, and Lila had not said anything, and the wall had gained its first brick. The second time had been 14 months ago. A woman named, she could not remember the exact name, but she remembered the face, remembered the coat, remembered the way the woman had stood at the sales desk while Brent spoke to her with the particular patience of a man explaining something to someone he did not believe was capable of understanding it. The woman had left within 10 minutes. She had been looking at a BMW 7 Series. She had been wearing a coat that probably cost more than Brent's monthly salary. She had been black. Lila wrote it all down. Her handwriting was small and neat and very fast. Across the room, Harlan Whitaker had moved to stand beside Amara. He had not touched her shoulder, had not made any gesture that presumed what she needed from him. He simply stood close enough to be present and far enough to give her room. "How are you doing?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm okay," she said. Then, after a brief pause, "I'll be better once I have my morning back." Something moved through Harlan's expression. Brief and complex, and quickly contained. "I owe you an apology. What happened in this building today?" "You didn't make the call," Amara said. "No, but it's my name on the door." She looked at him for a moment. "General?" she said. And the word carried in it 20 years of history. The plebe year, the early mornings, the particular standard he had held every student in that classroom to, without exception or apology. The voice that had said, "Rank is earned, not assumed," in a room full of 19-year-olds who were still learning what that meant. "You came in. That's what matters." He nodded once. Then he turned and looked at Brent Caldwell, who had not moved from the spot where Harlan's single word had stopped him. Brent was 41 days from his 5-year anniversary at the dealership. He had a lease on his Audi that ran through April. He had been planning to ask for a raise at his annual review in 6 weeks. He had spent 4 years building a quiet, comfortable career on a foundation that had felt until approximately 20 minutes ago completely solid. He looked at Harlan Whitaker's face and understood with the specific and terrible clarity that arrives when a story you have been telling yourself for years suddenly ends that the foundation was gone. "Brent," Harlan said. His voice was not raised. It was not cold. It was something more final than either. It was the voice of a man stating a conclusion that had already been reached and did not require debate. "My office. Now." Brent walked. His footsteps sounded very loud in the quiet. Lila Park turned to a third page on her legal pad and kept writing. And outside on Westfield Boulevard, a supervisor unit from Zone 5 was pulling to the curb. The supervisor unit parked at the curb outside shortly thereafter. Through the tall glass facade of the showroom, Amara watched it arrive. She watched the driver's side door open and a woman step out. Compact, purposeful, in full uniform, moving with the economy of motion that came from years of walking into situations that had already gone wrong. The woman paused at the entrance, took one broad visual sweep of the room, and came through the door. Sergeant Lena Nolan was 41 years old and had been with the Atlanta PD for 16 years. She had worked Zone 5 for the last 7 of those, and in 7 years she had developed a finely calibrated sense for the particular shape of a situation that had gotten away from everyone involved. She walked in, identified Harlan Whitaker by the photograph she had looked up on her phone during the short drive over, and crossed the floor toward him. She did not look at Dalton immediately. That was deliberate. She had learned a long time ago that looking at the officer first communicated the wrong thing. It told the room that the officer was still the center of gravity, still the authority, still the person around whom everything else organized itself. She looked at Harlan first, then at Amara, then finally at Dalton. What she saw in his face told her most of what she needed to know. She had seen that expression before on younger officers, on officers who had made decisions in the field that felt correct in the moment and revealed themselves to be catastrophic in retrospect. The expression of a man who had committed to a direction and discovered too late that the ground in that direction had already fallen away. "Sergeant Nolan," Harlan said. "General?" She turned to Amara. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Lena Nolan, Zone 5 Supervisor. I want to start by saying that what happened here this morning should not have happened. I'm sorry you experienced it in this building or anywhere else." Amara looked at her. She studied the woman's face the way she studied everything, with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who had learned that the details most people overlooked were usually the ones that mattered most. She saw no performance in Nolan's expression, no managed public relations. She saw a woman who meant what she said and was uncomfortable with the fact that she needed to say it. "Thank you," Amara said. It was the first thing she had said in several minutes that wasn't a legal assertion or a direct response to a threat. And the simplicity of it, the absence of anger, the absence of performance, the plain human acknowledgement of one woman by another, seemed to shift something in the room more quietly and more completely than anything that had come before it. Harlan turned slightly toward Amara. "Are you all right?" She was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, She had known the answer since the handcuffs came off, and she had pressed her right thumb into her left palm and felt her own pulse and confirmed that she was still intact in all the ways that mattered. She was quiet because she was deciding how much of the answer to give. "I've been through worse," she said finally. "That doesn't make this acceptable." "No," Harlan said. "It doesn't." She looked down at her hands for a moment. The marks left by the cuffs were faint. She had kept her wrists relaxed because tensing against restraints only made them cut deeper, a thing she had learned not in any manual, but from a conversation with a Special Forces medic in a forward operating base in Poland, who had been detained briefly at a checkpoint and had offered the advice as casually as he might offer directions. Small knowledge. The kind you accumulated in a life lived in uniform without ever intending to need it. "I want to tell you something," she said. She was speaking to Harlan, but her voice carried clearly enough that Nolan heard it, and the nearest customers heard it, and the man in the Georgia Tech sweatshirt, who had finally lowered his phone but had not moved from his spot near the Range Rover, heard it. "I came here today to buy my mother a car. My mother is turning 70 soon. She has driven the same Honda for 12 years. She has never asked me for a single thing that she didn't believe I could reasonably give. I have been deployed for 9 of the last 14 months. Germany. Poland. Before that, Afghanistan. Before that, Iraq. I am a trauma surgeon. I operate on people who are dying, and I try to make sure they don't. I have been doing that for 14 years. She paused, not for effect, but to let the words settle into the accurate shape of the thing she was describing. I walked into this building this morning in a gray hoodie and jeans because it is my day off, and I'm allowed to look however I want on my day off. I had a check in my pocket. I had a car already picked out. I had a plan." She looked at Harlan. "And a man who works in your buildings looked at my skin and decided that none of that was possible. And a police officer looked at the same thing and decided the same thing. And I stood in handcuffs in front of every person in this room because 2 men looking at a black woman in a gray hoodie reached the same conclusion, that I could not possibly belong here." The room was absolutely still. "I want people to understand," she continued, her voice dropping slightly, "that my dignity did not come from you walking through that door, General. I am grateful that you did, but my dignity was never theirs to take. I never gave it to them." Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, completely, the nod of a man receiving something true. Behind her, she heard Lila Park set down her pen. The general manager's office at Whitaker Luxury Motors was on the 2nd floor, accessed by a glass staircase at the rear of the showroom. It had a view of the sales floor below, and, through the window on the opposite wall, of the outdoor lot where the pre-owned inventory sat in clean, evenly spaced rows beneath the late morning sun. Brent Caldwell stood in the middle of that office and did not sit down. He had not been invited to sit down. He stood with his hands at his sides and his weight distributed evenly between both feet in the conscious stance of a man bracing for impact. Harlan Whitaker came through the door shortly after Brent did. He did not close it behind him. He walked to the window that overlooked the sales floor, looked down at the room below, at Sergeant Nolan, at Amara, at the customers who had not left, at Lila Park sitting straight-backed at the reception desk with a legal pad in front of her. And then he turned around. He looked at Brent the way certain men look at a thing they built with their own hands and have just discovered is broken. Not with rage, not with the theatrical disappointment of someone performing an emotion for an audience, but with the quiet, complete, and entirely unsentimental recognition of a problem that needed to be resolved. "Tell me what you told the dispatcher," Harlan said. Brent's mouth opened. "General, I want to explain the situation from my perspective. I was acting on what I believed to be a legitimate concern about a potential—" "Tell me what you told the dispatcher," Harlan said again. The repetition was not impatient. It was precise. Brent closed his mouth. He looked at the floor. I said we had a suspicious individual. Female, possibly casing the inventory. Casing the inventory? Harlan repeated. She was standing next to a display vehicle that was unlocked for customer access. The same vehicle she had told you before you made the call that she intended to purchase. She didn't have proof of funds. She showed you a personal check for $89,500. Personal checks can be… Brent! The name landed like a full stop. I have been running this dealership for 18 years. I have a policy. It is written into our training manual. It is covered in every onboarding session, and it is posted in the staff corridor on the same board where we list our monthly targets. That no customer is to be asked for proof of funds prior to a test drive unless there is a documented reason specific to that transaction. There is no documented reason here. There is a black woman in a gray hoodie, and there is your decision. Brent said nothing. How many times has this happened? Harlan asked. I don't know what you… How many times have you called the police or security or in any other way acted to remove a customer from this floor based on an assessment that had nothing to do with their behavior and everything to do with how they looked? The silence that followed was its own answer. Brent's eyes moved briefly to the left. The involuntary saccade of a man performing a count he didn't want to perform in front of an audience. I have documentation, said a voice from the doorway. Both men turned. Lila Park stood at the threshold of the open door, the legal pad held in both hands. Her posture carried the slightly rigid quality of someone who has made a decision and is moving forward on it before their nerve fails them. I have documentation, she said again, of this incident and of 2 prior incidents that I witnessed but did not report. She looked at Harlan directly. I should have reported them. I didn't, and I am sorry for that. I'm reporting them now. She walked into the office and placed the legal pad on the desk. 3 pages of small, neat handwriting. Dates, times, names, descriptions. The complete record of what silence had cost laid out in ink on paper and offered forward without ceremony. Harlan looked at the pages. He did not pick them up immediately. He looked at Lila Park. Thank you, he said. She nodded. She did not look at Brent. Brent looked at the legal pad on the desk and understood with the specific and terrible finality that comes from watching a door close that there was nothing left to negotiate. Harlan opened the top drawer of the desk and produced 2 sheets of paper already printed, already filled in. He placed them on the surface next to Lila's legal pad. Brent recognized the format before he read a single word. He had seen termination paperwork before from the other side of the desk. Twice in his 4 years, both times for junior staff. Both times signed off by the general manager without much ceremony. His name was at the top. Effective today, Harlan said, your access to the building and the systems will be revoked before you reach the parking lot. HR will contact you regarding the formal process. He paused. I want to be clear about something, Brent. This is not a disciplinary measure. It is not a reprimand. It is the end of your employment here. There is a difference. Brent picked up the papers with hands that were not entirely steady. He looked at his name at the top of the page. He put the papers back down. My uncle, Your uncle, Harlan said, does not work here. Brent left the office. His footsteps moved down the glass staircase slowly, and every person on the showroom floor below watched him cross toward the exit without speaking to anyone, without looking at Amara, without pausing at the desk where he had left his phone charger and a half-finished bottle of water hours earlier. The front door opened, the bell above it chimed, and Brent Caldwell walked out into the morning and kept walking. Bryce Dalton had been standing in the same spot on the showroom floor for some time. He had not been asked to leave. He had not been told to wait. He had simply stopped moving at some point after the handcuffs came off Amara's wrists, and his body had made the quiet, involuntary decision that staying still was safer than any direction he might choose to walk in. So he stood near the consultation table with his hands at his sides and his radio on his shoulder, and the growing corrosive awareness that the room around him had reorganized itself entirely. That the authority he had walked in with, which had felt as solid and as self-evident as the badge on his chest, had been quietly and completely redistributed to people who had not needed a uniform to carry it. Sergeant Lena Nolan had been on her phone for the last several minutes, standing near the entrance with her back to the room, speaking in the low, precise cadence of someone relaying facts to someone else who was writing them down. When she ended the call, she put the phone in her pocket, turned around, and walked directly to Dalton. She stopped in front of him. She did not position herself with aggression. She was not that kind of supervisor, and this was not that kind of moment. She stood at a professional distance and looked at him with an expression that was not unkind and was not forgiving, and was something more difficult than either. "Bryce," she said. She used his first name deliberately, not to soften the blow, to make sure he understood that what was happening now was not procedural. It was real. "I need your badge and your weapon." Dalton looked at her. The request was not unexpected. He had known it was coming from the moment Harlan ended his first phone call, but the knowing had not made it smaller. "Sarge, if I could just walk you through my reasoning at the time of the call." "I've seen the recordings," Nolan said. 3 of them. They were sent to my phone in the last little while by people standing in this room." She paused. "I don't need your reasoning right now, Bryce. I need your badge and your weapon." A customer near the front of the showroom, the elderly man who had been mid-sentence when Dalton first walked in, who had never quite found the thread of his conversation again, looked away. Not in discomfort, but in the particular kind of courtesy that some people extend to someone in the moment of losing something they cannot get back. Dalton reached up and unclipped his badge from his chest. He held it for a moment. 1 second. 2. Looking at it the way people look at objects they have carried so long that the weight of them has become indistinguishable from their own weight. Then he placed it in Nolan's hand. His weapon followed. He unholstered it with careful, practiced movements, cleared the chamber, engaged the safety, and handed it over grip first. His hands were steady. That surprised him. He had expected them to shake, and they didn't. And somehow, the steadiness was worse than shaking would have been because it made the moment feel too calm, too manageable, too much like a procedure, and not enough like the thing it actually was. "You're relieved of duty, effective now," Nolan said. "Pending a full external review of this incident and your prior use of force file. You'll receive formal notification of the review process at your address on file soon." She looked at him carefully. "Do you have someone who can drive you home?" "I have my car," Dalton said. "Bryce, do you have someone who can drive you home?" He looked at her. He understood what she was asking. Not logistically, but in the larger sense of the question. In the sense of whether there was a person who knew him well enough to be useful to him in the next several hours. He thought about it honestly, which was something he had not done in a while. "I'll call my brother," he said. "Good," Nolan said. She walked away. She crossed the floor toward Harlan and Amara, who were standing together near the GLE 45. Oh, the car that had started all of this, which was still sitting on its platform with the driver's side door closed and its obsidian black finish catching the light in the particular way of a thing that has been waiting patiently to be part of a better story. Dalton stood alone. The consultation table was behind him. The front doors were ahead of him. The room was full of people who were no longer looking at him, not from indifference, but from the decency of not watching a man stand in the wreckage of his own decisions any longer than was necessary. He thought about the 3 complaints. He had known about them. Of course he had. He had known about Dr. Calvin Foster, though he had not known the man's name at the time. He had known about the woman in the expensive coat, though he had also not known her name. He had known about a 3rd incident that he thought of in the private accounting he sometimes conducted late at night as a misunderstanding, a word that had served him reasonably well as a container for things he preferred not to examine too closely. He thought about Amara Reeves standing with her spine straight and her hands visible, and her voice level and refusing through all of it to become the thing that the situation had been designed to make her. He thought about the envelope in her pocket. He walked to the front doors and pushed through them into the morning. The air outside was warm and smelled like car exhaust and freshly cut grass from the median strip on Westfield Boulevard. He sat down on a low concrete planter near the entrance, took out his phone, and called his brother. The line rang 3 times. "Hey," his brother said. "What's up? Can you come get me?" Dalton said. "I'll explain when you get here." The video went live later that day. The man in the Georgia Tech sweatshirt. His name was Jamal Hayes, and he was a 38-year-old high school history teacher from Decatur who had come to Whitaker Luxury Motors to look at a used SUV for his wife. Had spent some time after the incident sitting in his car in the parking lot watching the footage on his phone, deciding what to do with it. He was not someone who posted things on the internet for the satisfaction of posting them. He was someone who understood from years of teaching teenagers about the architecture of history that documentation mattered, that the difference between things that changed and things that didn't was very often simply whether there was a record. He posted it to 3 platforms simultaneously with a caption that was 11 words long. Black Army Colonel handcuffed at Atlanta dealership for buying a car. By later that afternoon, it had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. By evening, it had been viewed millions of times. It had been covered by multiple news outlets and had generated a statement from the Atlanta Police Department acknowledging the incident and confirming that Officer Bryce Dalton had been relieved of duty pending review. It had also generated a statement from the office of Councilman Victor Caldwell, Brent's uncle, a 2-term city council member whose district included the Westfield Boulevard corridor, expressing confidence in the police department's review process and offering his personal regrets to the affected individual. The statement was drafted by an aide, released that afternoon, and was received by the internet with the specific, concentrated skepticism reserved for statements released on weekends by politicians who have become tangentially associated with a story that is moving faster than they can manage. Councilman Caldwell would spend the following week in a series of increasingly uncomfortable phone calls that he had not anticipated and could not control. That story belonged to a later chapter. On the next business day, the Georgia Law Enforcement Oversight Commission convened a formal hearing. The hearing room was on the 4th floor of a state office building on Washington Street in downtown Atlanta. It had fluorescent lighting and institutional carpet and a long table at the front where the commission members sat. And it looked like every room in which consequential things are decided, deliberately, almost aggressively unremarkable, as though the gravity of what happened inside it needed no architectural assistance. Harlan Whitaker sat at the center of the commission table. To his left was a civil rights attorney named Josephine Crane. To his right was a retired federal judge named Marcus Lang, who had joined the commission the previous year and had in his first months developed a reputation for the kind of patient, methodical attention to detail that made people who had corners to cut deeply uncomfortable. Bryce Dalton sat at the table facing them. He had not slept well. He was wearing a gray suit and had chosen it carefully that morning because it was the most neutral thing he owned. Not the navy blue he wore to formal events, which felt like it was reaching for something, and not the casual clothes he would have worn at home, which felt like they were conceding something. The gray suit was a compromise that had not fully satisfied him. Across the room, Lila Park sat in the gallery. She had brought her legal pad. She had also brought a second document, a formal written statement prepared with the assistance of Harlan's legal team over the weekend that detailed both prior incidents she had witnessed. Her hands were folded on top of the pad. She was composed in the way that people who have made a difficult decision and committed to it are composed. Not entirely comfortable, but no longer in conflict with themselves. The hearing began. The video was shown first, 4 minutes and 22 seconds. The room watched in silence. When it ended, Judge Lang leaned forward and asked Dalton a single question. At the moment you applied the restraints, what was the specific articulable behavior that constituted the basis for detention? Dalton answered. His answer was careful and technically structured and referenced dispatch protocols and field assessment guidelines, and it took some time to deliver. When he finished, Lang looked at him for a long moment. "You've described a framework," he said. "I asked for a behavior." The 3 prior complaints were reviewed next. Each one had been resolved internally by Captain Wayne Ehlers with a notation of no actionable finding. Ehlers sat in the gallery behind Dalton in a suit that fit him less well than his uniform did, and watched the commission read through the documentation with the expression of a man who has been asked to wait in a room where the temperature is slowly rising. Later, Harlan addressed the room. He spoke without notes. He spoke about the responsibility of institutions, not in the abstract philosophical sense that makes people feel that a point is being made at them, but in the specific, concrete sense of a man who had built something and understood that the thing he built carried an obligation that outlasted any single incident. He spoke about the 18 years of the dealership. He spoke about what the name above the door was supposed to mean to every person who walked through it, regardless of what they looked like or what they were wearing or what car they had parked in the lot outside. He spoke about Amara Reeves for 45 seconds. He did not describe what had happened to her. He described what kind of person she was and what she had given, and the specific indignity of what she had been asked to absorb in exchange for the simple act of trying to buy her mother a birthday present. The room was very quiet when he finished. Later that afternoon, the commission delivered its findings. Dalton terminated effective immediately. Ehlers suspended pending a full independent review of his case management record. The Atlanta PD directed to implement mandatory external oversight of all internal use-of-force complaint resolutions for a period of not less than 3 years. Outside in the corridor, Amara's attorney, Julian Reese, was already on the phone. The civil courtroom of Judge Elaine Tanner was on the 7th floor of the Fulton County Courthouse, and it looked, as all courtrooms do, like old paper and central air conditioning, and the particular kind of institutional seriousness that accumulates in rooms where consequential things have been decided for a very long time. Judge Tanner had been on the bench for 19 years. She was 62 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, and a reputation, well-established and widely respected across the Atlanta legal community, for a specific kind of impatience, not with complexity, which she welcomed, but with evasion. She had no tolerance for answers that were constructed to avoid the question being asked, and she communicated this without raising her voice, which made it considerably more effective. The civil case of Reeves versus City of Atlanta and Whitaker Luxury Motors had been filed shortly after the incident. Julian Reese, Amara's attorney, had submitted a complaint that ran to 43 pages and cited violations under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, Deprivation of Civil Rights under Color of Law, as well as the Georgia Equal Access to Public Accommodations Act, which prohibited discrimination in places of business on the basis of race. The city's legal team had spent the intervening weeks attempting to negotiate a quiet resolution. They had proposed in sequence 3 different settlement figures. The first 2 had been declined. The third, $340,000, accompanied by a formal written acknowledgement of civil rights violations, had been accepted, not because Amara needed the money, but because the written acknowledgement mattered. Because there was a difference between a number on a check and a sentence in a legal document that said in plain language that what happened was wrong and who was responsible for it. The portion of the case that proceeded to the courtroom concerned Brent Caldwell and the civil claim of racial discrimination in a place of public accommodation. Brent sat at the defendant's table in a Navy suit. He had lost weight in the weeks since his termination, not dramatically, but visibly, in the way that stress distributes itself across a person's face and removes the comfortable certainty that used to live there. His attorney, a competent and thoroughly unremarkable man named Bryce Patton, had advised him that the evidence was not favorable and that a negotiated resolution was almost certainly in his best interest. Brent had insisted on contesting it. He had told himself in the weeks between his termination and this morning a version of events in which he was a professional who had acted on reasonable concern, whose judgment had been catastrophically misread, whose career had been ended by a confluence of factors that had very little to do with who he actually was. He had told himself this story with the same commitment he had brought to every story he had ever constructed about himself, with conviction, with detail, and with the particular stubbornness of a man who had never been seriously required to examine the gap between his self-image and his behavior. Judge Tanner had read Lila Park's testimony. She had reviewed the employment records that Harlan's legal team had submitted, which showed the pattern of customer interactions Brent had conducted over 4 years. Specifically, the documented instances where Black customers had been asked for proof of funds before test drives, cross-referenced against the records of white customers who had not been asked the same question in the same period. 14 instances over 4 years. 14 Black customers asked for documentation that was not required by dealership policy, that was not requested of comparable white customers, that served no legitimate business purpose beyond the expression of a presumption. The testimony took 1 day. Lila Park spoke for 40 minutes. Her voice was steady throughout. She did not editorialize. She stated what she had seen, the dates on which she had seen it, and the reasons she had not spoken sooner. That last part, the reasons she had not spoken sooner, was the part that cost her the most to say. And she said it anyway because she had decided that the cost of honesty was something she could bear, and the cost of continued silence was something she could not. Amara testified for 25 minutes. She was in civilian clothes, a dark blazer over a cream blouse, her hair natural, her posture, the same precise verticality it always was. She described the morning in the same methodical, sequential way she would describe a surgical procedure. Beginning, middle, each step accounted for. Nothing omitted, nothing inflated. She described the check in her pocket. She described the car she had chosen for her mother. She described the sound the handcuffs made. She did not cry. She did not look at Brent. She spoke to Judge Tanner, and Judge Tanner listened with the full, uninterrupted attention she gave to testimony she found significant. When it was over, Judge Tanner looked at her notes for a long moment. Then she looked at Brent. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "the record in this case reflects a consistent and documented pattern of treating Black customers as presumptively less legitimate than white customers in identical circumstances. You made a phone call that resulted in a decorated military officer being placed in handcuffs while attempting to make a legal purchase. The evidence does not support the characterization of this as an isolated error in judgment. It supports the characterization of it as the predictable outcome of a habit. She paused. Judgment for the plaintiff. Damages in the amount of $75,000. Additionally, pursuant to the court's authority under the Georgia Equal Access Act, you are prohibited from employment in any customer-facing sales role for a period of 3 years. The gavel came down. In the second row of the gallery, Vivian Reeves, 70 years old soon, wearing a yellow dress she had bought specifically for this occasion, reached over and took her daughter's hand. Amara looked at her mother. Vivian looked back at her with an expression that contained in the compressed and efficient language of a woman who had spent 38 years watching her daughter move through a world that did not always make room for her, everything that did not need to be said out loud. Outside in the corridor, a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution asked Amara if she had a statement. She thought for a moment. "Tell people," she said, "that the check was already written. All I wanted was to give it to them." Hartsfield-Jackson, Atlanta International Airport early one morning had the particular quality of a place that exists outside of ordinary time. Bright and relentless and full of people who are all in their various ways in the middle of becoming somewhere else. Amara moved through the terminal with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times and had long since made peace with the specific indignities of early morning travel. She had one carry-on and a duffel bag that weighed exactly what it was allowed to weigh. She had her boarding pass on her phone and her passport in the left interior pocket of her jacket. She had a coffee she had purchased at a kiosk near the entrance, and she was drinking it slowly, which was the only luxury the next 16 hours of travel would reliably afford her. She was in uniform. It was the first time in the week since the incident at the dealership that most of the people in her life had seen her in it. Her mother had seen it, of course. Vivian Reeves had helped iron the jacket the previous evening, standing at the ironing board in the kitchen with the careful, unhurried attention she brought to every task she considered important, pressing each crease with the deliberateness of someone who understood that the details of a thing were where its meaning lived. But outside of that kitchen, outside of that house, this was the first morning she had put it on and walked into a public space. The eagle on her shoulder, the bronze star on her chest, the Army Commendation Medal beside it, and the others in their precise, regulated order, each one a coordinate on the map of 14 years. The uniform was olive green and fit her exactly as it should, and she wore it the way she wore everything, without announcement, without performance, as though it were simply the accurate description of who she was. Harlan Whitaker was waiting near the security checkpoint. He had not told her he was coming. He had sent a message the previous evening that said only, "I'll be there at 6." And she had read it, and not replied because she did not need to. She had understood when she saw him that he was not there to say anything in particular. He was there the way certain people are present at certain moments, not because their presence resolves anything, but because it acknowledges something, and the acknowledgement matters. He was in the same khaki pants and a different polo shirt, dark blue this time, and he looked exactly as he always looked, which was like a man who had spent 31 years learning that the room adjusts to you, not the other way around. He looked at her in the uniform for a moment. "You look like yourself," he said. "I always do." He smiled. It was a brief smile, contained, but genuine in the way of smiles that are not performed for anyone's benefit. "How's your mother? She drove the GLE to church recently," Amara said. "She called me afterward to tell me that 3 people in the parking lot asked her about it. She said she told all 3 of them it was a gift from her daughter." "As it should be," Harlan said. They stood together for a moment in the current of the terminal, people moving around them in both directions, rolling bags and strollers, and the particular focused energy of early morning travelers who have somewhere to be. "The foundation," Harlan said. "Julian tells me the paperwork cleared recently," Amara confirmed. The Reeves Foundation, incorporated under Georgia law, funded with the full $340,000 from the city's settlement, supplemented by a contribution from Harlan that she had argued against and eventually accepted. Its stated purpose was the provision of legal support and advocacy services to individuals who had experienced racial discrimination in places of public accommodation. Its first intake coordinator, a sharp-minded recent law school graduate named Jada Cole, had started the previous week. "She handled it better than I would have," Harlan said. It was unclear whether he meant Jada or Amara or Vivian, perhaps all three. "You handled it the way it needed to be handled," Amara said. "You came in," he looked at her. "You were already handling it." "Yes," she said. "But there are rooms that change faster when someone like you walks in. That's not an indictment. It's a fact. And the question isn't whether that's fair. The question is what people who understand it decide to do with it." Harlan was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the tall windows of the terminal, the Atlanta sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, that specific transitional gray that precedes the first real color of morning. "Take care of yourself over there," he said. "I take care of everyone else," she said. "I'm very good at it." She picked up her duffel bag. She extended her hand. He took it. The same grip he had given her 20 years ago, when she graduated, when she pinned on her first rank, when she came back from her first deployment looking older in the way that the first deployment always ages people. Not in years, but in the particular weight they carry afterward. She walked toward the checkpoint. She did not look back, not because the moment behind her didn't matter, but because the direction she was moving in mattered more, and she had always understood the difference. The security line parted slightly as she approached. A TSA officer looked up, registered the uniform, and gave a small professional nod. She returned it. She placed her duffel on the conveyor belt. She put her coffee cup in the bin. She walked through the scanner and collected her things on the other side and kept moving. In a few days, she would be back at Landstuhl. In a few more days, she would be back in surgery. The world that needed her was waiting as it always was, with the same relentless and unambiguous demand, and she had never once failed to answer it. Behind her in the terminal, the morning light came through the windows and fell across the floor in long, warm panels. And in the parking lot of Whitaker Luxury Motors on Westfield Boulevard, the first customer of the day, a black woman in her 50s, in a neat wool coat and sensible shoes, moving with the unhurried purpose of someone who knows what she wants and has come to get it, pushed through the glass doors. 3 salesmen stepped forward to meet her. Dignity is not something a badge can strip away or a pair of handcuffs can contain. Amara Reeves walked into that showroom knowing exactly who she was, and she walked out the same person. The uniform was always there. The check was always written. What changed was simply who finally chose to see her. If this story stayed with you, drop your city in the comments and tell us why. And if you believe these voices deserve to be heard, subscribe. We'll keep telling the stories that matter.